3/4 of our townscape has been produced in the last 75 years. We're so familiar with the styles of these houses that, without an effort, we don't even see them. Because so many large areas of our towns and cities embody the visual inheritance of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, it's too easy to assume that the forms which building took during this period were in some way normal. Such a massive contribution to the world about us surely requires some analysis. In this programme, I want to trace the evolution of the English semi-detached house from its origin in the late 19th century. I want to consider how designs developed, and suggest that, in one way at least, social and economic pressures were, perhaps, more significant than aesthetic decisions in moulding the appearance of the suburban style. This programme, then, is about the style of housing in a London suburb. I've chosen to study Ilford, on the east side of London, but I could just as easily have chosen Finchley or Croydon to make my point. Each area of London's inner ring of suburbs expanded at a similar rate during the period of our course. In 1890, Ilford was just becoming a suburb. It was still a very small town, surrounded predominantly by farmland and a number of large houses. It was around the year 1885 that Ilford began to assume the character of a suburb. The word suburb comes from the Latin meaning adjacent to the city. By its very nature, the suburb depends on a nearby city, but is geographically remote from it. I'm standing outside the booking hall of Ilford Station. It still looks much the same now as it did when it was built in the 1890s, and curiously enough, it looks something like the Edwardian housing which surrounds it. The railway, of course, was central to the development of Ilford. It created the link with the city. The Cheap Trains Act of 1883 reduced the duty on rail fares with the aim of encouraging working men to live outside central London, where rents were high, and commute into work. The 1883 Act was so successful that between 1890 and 1911, the number of trains leaving London stations rose from 257 a day to nearly 2,000. In the same period, Ilford's population rose in almost exactly the same proportion, from 11,000 to 79,000. The Cheap Trains Act was framed with the working man in mind, but there is evidence that it stimulated the exodus from London of a different class of people altogether. In fact, this act can be considered the statutory origins of commuting man. Ilford Station is surrounded by middle-class housing built for these commuters. Housing spread out from the station. The major building developers and the private railway companies were, in some ways, interdependent. Builders even guaranteed so many houses and so much commuter traffic in return for the development loans from the railway companies. In Ilford, the first old country estate to fall to the developers was the Clement's House estate in 1879. North of the High Road and to the east of the Cranbrook Road, the Ilford Lodge estate was built in 1883. Then the Grange House estate in 1894. The railway was expanded in the 1890s and 4 lines were provided. The Loxford Hall estate appeared to the south, and work started on the Cranbrook estate in 1897 and on the Downs Hall and Mayfield estates in 1898. Goodmayes Station was built solely to service the Mayfield estate. Most of the newcomers did not rent houses, as they had done in the city, but because of the modest cost of suburban housing, were able to buy their own homes. Mortgages were available, often from the builders themselves. There was also help from local authorities, who, by the Small Dwellings Acquisition Act of 1899, had themselves been empowered to offer low-interest loans to house purchasers. Early in the century, it was possible to buy a house costing more than £300 for a down payment of only £25. There were 4 principal factors which shaped the Edwardian suburb: housing demand, the availability of development land, the need to be within walking distance of the station, and low cost and consumer choice. The result of all these factors was the typical Edwardian terrace. So successful was this housing in Ilford that the guidebook of 1911 maintained that no suburb has attained such popularity in so short a time, and as indicating the satisfaction of those who come to reside there, there is no suburb where so many of the residents own their own houses. In the creation of Ilford, the idea has always been to preserve as much as possible of the rurality which existed before the builder descended upon it. Ilford appeals strongly to the residential classes who desire a clean, healthy, up-to-date town close to London, yet on the borders of the countryside. Ilford promised less noise, less pollution and more greenery than London, and all this at less expense. But what did the new housing have to offer? The new residents of Ilford expected to be owner-occupiers. This in itself affects style and taste, for a man who lives in a house which he owns himself is anxious that it should both look in good order and express his own personality. We're going to look at a house built on the Mayfield estate by the developer Archibald Cameron Corbett between 1898 and 1899. The estate consists of long, parallel rows of terraces. The public health legislation of the 1870s had, among other things, dictated the distance between houses, whereas, on the other hand, the builders wanted to maximize land use. The result was street scenes like these, either architecturally uniform or monotonous and dull, depending on your point of view. The two-storey houses were mostly built in short rows of 4. To save space, the frontages were fairly narrow. The facade was designed to give an impression of wealth and dignity at as low a price as possible. The house has 3 bays, with the outer 2 canted and lit on 3 sides. The entrance doorway and windows of this house are surrounded by dignifying classical motifs, suitably simplified for mass production. Because of this, there is an effect of plainness. This is clear at the doorway. There's an open porch with the door standing behind a pompous device with attached columns, each with 4 flutes, topped by capitals which no Greek builder ever used, supporting an absolutely plain architrave which carries a segmental lintel. The ornament should perhaps be egg and dart or bead and reel, but the intricacies of these would have undermined the economies necessary in this building and, instead, a vastly more simplified pattern, known only to the 19th century speculative builder, was introduced. The window surrounds follow similar principles. The vertical bars are a debased classical column of standard length. You can see that for the ground floor windows, which are taller than the upper ones, the column ends before the full height of the window is reached, and it has had to be extended by some plain, artificial stonework. At least this is evidence that the architect cared about proportion. He was committed to using columns of this standard length and, rather than limit the height of his ground floor windows to the height of the columns, and make them look ludicrously squat into the bargain, he preferred to contrive to stretch them. On the ground floor window there is some more of the by-the-yard moulding. The builder has tried to de-emphasize the height forced on him by the narrow frontage by using an extended string course, supported by consoles, to divide the upper from the lower half of the house. Consoles also support the eaves at the corners and around the central upper window, where the decorative effect, the builder must have thought, was getting a bit thin. The whole facade stands on a base of artificial stone, which has little metal ventilation grills let into it directly beneath the centre lights of each bay, to create a through draft under the floorboards. To complete the decoration, a checkerboard tiled pavement leads through the garden and up to the front door. The house as a whole has a hipped roof, or more accurately a quarter of one, for it's in a row of 4, and over each protruding bay there are little gablets. The effect of decoration and dignity was meant to exalt the passer-by as much as the actual resident. Look at the rear of the house. The expensive, hard, crisp, red bricks were used only for the facade, and, to the sides and back, a much rougher, cheaper stock was employed. Similarly, the formal order which was apparent on the facade disappears when you look at the back of the house. It is an abstract and careless composition of odd windows, doors, and drain pipes. Essentially, the plan divides the rear of the ground floor from the front. The front part of the plan contains the spacious sitting room, well lit by enormous bays and decorated by plaster mouldings of classical ornament bought, once again, by the yard, but more intricate than outside because finer materials could be used. There is a long hall which separates the sitting room from the slightly smaller dining room. These three spaces comprise the living accommodation. At the very back of the hall are the service rooms. On the left of the plan was the original kitchen. Against the partition wall there was a large range used for cooking and heating water. Immediately next to it was a large pantry which, before the days of refrigerators, had two of its walls exposed in the air of the garden to help keep the food and preserves cool from the heat of the kitchen. To the right of the hall, a door opens into the washroom, which originally had a copper in the lower right-hand corner. The concrete floor sloped toward the drain, and by the washroom is the outside lavatory. A door directly beneath the staircase leads into the cellar, stretching the length of the house underneath the hall. Originally it was used for storing coal, and in front of the entrance doorway there is a coal hole conveniently let into the tiled pavement. The rear of the house was designed as the working area. The narrow passage at the rear of the hall symbolizes the split between serving and living quarters. Because it was designed with servants in mind, almost half the ground floor space is given over to servicing functions. Further to symbolize the distinction between the servants and the master, notice that once through the door at the end of the passage, all ornamentation ends. This area at the back of the house was a degenerate form of the old servants' hall. The upstairs plan is not symmetrical with the ground floor, but there is still a clear articulation of function. By far the greater amount of space is taken up by the master bedroom, which occupies almost 2/3 of the frontage of the house. This room was originally heated by an open fire, as were the second and third bedrooms. The fourth bedroom, which opens out from the left of the small landing, was designed for the maid. Immediately next to it is the bathroom and lavatory. The plan here is simple and uncontrived. These houses were uniform, partly through the restrictions of planning bylaws, and partly through a need for economy. They achieved a certain dignity of design, a degree of poise and self-confidence, and, in using decent materials, created a decent and comfortable pattern of housing. Between 1900 and 1910, Ilford continued to grow, and it was in 1910 that the Valentine's Park estate was built by the Town Planning and Garden Cities Company. We can clearly see the evolution from the wide, visually arid bylaw street into the more intimate style of the suburban road. The demand for houses was slackening, and land could now be used more generously. This very development suggests to us that the builders were becoming increasingly conscious of the role they were creating for themselves as the fathers of our built environment. Built on an old estate, the development reminds us that Ilford's character was essentially a rural one. Details we associate with the suburban style are emerging here in rustic surroundings. The houses are now semi-detached, giving the sense of privacy so dear to the homeowner, and the Italianate and classical bays of Victorian houses are being replaced by more compact units with smaller gables. What at the Mayfield estate was a classical doorway is changing into a canopied wooden porch. Valentine's Park was created under the conscious influence of the garden suburbs, such as Port Sunlight, Bedford Park, and Hampstead. The Garden City theory was created to counteract the seemingly irrepressible spread of London. Yet, it was the very same developers who caused the spreading effect, who took over an aspect of Garden City theory, bastardized it, and created the semi-detached suburb. After the First World War, Ilford continued to grow. Development centred around Gants Hill and Newbury Park. The new occupants were still largely middle-class commuters, but they could now rely on buses and trams. even the motorcycle and private car, to take them into the mainline stations and thence to London. The fundamental influences shaping the suburbs in the 1920s and 1930s were less pressure on land because improved road transport enabled the suburb to spread, a developing taste for individuality in domestic expression, and the disappearance of servants from middle-class homes. These economic and social changes brought about a change in house styles, but the new styles were rooted in the garden city developments we saw at Valentine's Park. Street layout varied, and there was also a growing taste for personal individualism in the style of the home. The Semi provided just as much for the commuting middle classes as the kind of Victorian terrace we have been looking at. It flattered the owner that the whole of the frontage was his own, while he only paid for half of it. It offered privacy and individuality at a low price. A typical mature semi-detached house, of course, has design details which owe little to any precedent. Curious patterns of stained glass and unusual patterns of gates, imbued with the iconography of the 1920s and 1930s. Sailing boats and sunsets, rustic cottages and remote country farms. There's a clue to the origins of the suburban style in the history of art. The arts and crafts movement wanted to encourage craftsmanship and the use of good, simple, honest materials. Individual creation was lauded, mass production was reviled. Similarly, the town planners of the Garden City movement encouraged the thin packing of houses, the use of curved roads, an innovation at the time, and the idea of the unity of town and country. This simple house was built in 1928. It's a modest building, but it was created for people with much the same sort of tastes as those who bought the new houses on the Mayfield estate in the 1890s. Unlike the more prosperous suburban housing in this period, there's relatively little decorative excess. There's no flamboyant timbering, stained glass or pargeting. Design here is reduced to its essentials, yet the builder sought to introduce some decorative variety by giving the houses alternatively hipped roofs and gabled roofs. Although this is a modest house, one important feature distinguishes it from its pre-war antecedent, and that is it stands firmly in its own ground. This is the most important form which the symbolism of wealth, so significant a feature of the suburban style, took. Here there are only 6 houses to the acre, a figure of even lower density than that of the garden cities. Not all the houses here had garages, but in every case space for a car was provided. In one area of Ilford at this time, the firm of Haynes and Warwick Limited were selling houses rather like these for £725 with a garage, or £100 less without one. As on the Mayfield estate, the aesthetic content of this house is largely deceitful. Deceitful, that is, in terms of the modern movement credo, that there must be truth to materials. Cheap bricks were used to build this house, but they were not left exposed. They were covered with rough casting. Only at ground level, where the bricks are visible, were more expensive ones used. The conception of the house was one of the severest simplicity. It is a rectangular box with a gabled, plain tile roof. It's difficult to apply conventional architectural analysis to a building of this type, but if forced, you could say that the facade was made up of 2 bays with an eccentric doorway. The windows are wooden casements, and both the lower casements and the entrance door are covered by a tiled, hipped canopy. It may not be very beautiful, but the house displays a more rational relationship of exterior form to internal function than did the Victorian terrace house in Goodmayes. Look at the elevation from the rear. Here, the windows and French doors are at least placed with some regard for appearance. The plan of the house, like the exterior, is extremely simple. we can immediately see that the house was never intended to accommodate a servant, for the service area was reduced to a small kitchen hidden in the back of the house and designed for compact, labour-saving equipment. A major design feature is the hall. The quarter landing is a concession only to decoration and not to function. Indeed, it rather impairs easy passage through the hall. It's a strong enough reminder that builders were anxious to flatter their customers by this quaint reference to a manorial staircase. The two main rooms of the house open from the hall. The sitting room is at the front, and the dining room, with its French doors, is at the rear and opens onto the garden. One corner of the dining room is cut off at an angle, providing a flue for the grate and a masking for the hot water pipes. Upstairs, there is a small landing with doors off it, leading to two smaller bedrooms at the front of the house and the master bedroom at the rear. In the corner of the landing, there is a fitted airing cupboard, and at the back, there are the bathroom and lavatory next to one another. And there we have it. A small English semi of the late 1920s, ideally suited to its function. It is directly descended from the Victorian terraced house, but it is altogether more rational and designed for families to live in alone at close quarters, with never the thought in mind of employing a servant. The semi was the despair of people of advanced taste in the 1920s and 1930s. In this course, we've already seen the famous international examples of modern architecture as a fine art. A prairie house by Frank Lloyd Wright, or a Viennese townhouse by Adolphe Loos, or a white concrete shape floating above the ground by Le Corbusier. Here we have a peculiarly British, even English episode in the history of architecture. Homespun? Yes. Created by social and economic pressures rather than by the intoxication of artistic creation? Yes. But we should have seen that, in its most usual form, the semi-detached house embodies the influence of two important schools of modern architectural philosophy. Generally, the layout of suburban streets follows the patterns favoured by the Garden Cities movement, in particular by Barry Parker and Raymond Unwin. Secondly, the forms and details of the houses embody the more or less remote influence of the arts and crafts styles of Bailey Scott and Voysey. Semi, therefore, appears to have reputable enough antecedents, and certainly it's popular. Indeed, it's one amongst the most distinctive architectural forms of all England. Why then is it not intellectually respectable? Perhaps just because it's been so very successful. Because the semi was a country-wide phenomenon, universally successful and popular, we must raise an issue of central importance. In the period we have discussed, a growing number of people were able to buy their own homes. Now, was the suburban style imposed on people by developers who forced their taste? Or was it, as I believe, a real expression of popular culture formed honestly out of people's own tastes and preferences? Look at the Le Corbusier housing at Pessac, and look at a semi-detached house, perhaps your own home. Which do you honestly think was the better machine for living in?